Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. I'm Tyler Waldrop here with Bama Insider, back for the next installment of our 20 for 20 series. Today we're talking about, returning quarterbacks in the SEC and which guy we expect to be perhaps the most efficient or most complete passer next year. Obviously, we have Tony Sukalis with Bama Insider. Tony, how are you doing today?
Doing pretty well.
We're also joined by guest Bryan Matthews with AuburnSports.com. How are you
Hello,
doing, Bryan?
Brad. They're doing great.
Great. Thanks for joining us. And then last but not least, we have Patrick Garbin with UGA Sports. How are you doing, Patrick?
Great. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate y'all for joining us. Tony, I'll just sort of start with you. I'll give you the home field advantage as it is. What's sort of the situation with Alabama at quarterback? And, do you expect Alabama's quarterback to be in this conversation as sort of, one of the top two guys in the conference next year?
Yeah, I think when you look at Mac Jones, he's a guy that he got 4 starts last year, filling in for Tua Tagovailoa. He did really well, and I think the case for Mac Jones is really we've kind of already seen what he can do against top level competition. He threw for 300 yards against Auburn and Michigan. And you look at his stats, what he averaged over those 4 starts is 293 yards and 3.25 touchdowns. Those are elite numbers. Those are numbers that you could see him get to New York with if he kept it over a complete season for the Heisman competition. So I think when you look at Mac Jones, that you're looking at a guy that could potentially be a pro prospect and a really efficient quarterback with a great offense.
Yeah, and then Bryan, obviously Bo Nix, he's probably the most recognizable name among SEC fans at this point. What do you sort of expect from him in year two, and do you expect him to sort of make that jump that would put him in this conversation?
I do. Bo Nix, SEC Freshman of the Year, put up a bunch of freshman records for Auburn last year, 2,500 yards, 16 touchdowns. Threw that last second touchdown to Seth Williams in his first ever college game. So he's sort of got that knack to be a playmaker when the game's on the line. You would expect him, with that experience he got, starting and playing in every game this past season, to step it up in year two. But he does have a new offensive coordinator. Auburn's got to replace 4 or 5 starters on the offensive line. So there's going to be a little transition there, and you just don't know how everything's going to work out. Plus, not being able to go through spring practice with these new linemen and new offense, how that's going to hold back this offense the first, say, month of the season.
Great. And then, Patrick, I think Georgia's probably in the weirdest point out of all of these schools quarterback-wise. Just sort of sum up, who do you expect to have that job? And, how do you sort of view them? Do you think they are a candidate, a guy that could emerge and be a household name by the end of the season?
Well, it's the starter is going to be Jamie Newman, unless the Wake Forest grad transfer, unless something crazy happens. The thing is, he's unproven at this level. When I mean this level, I mean we're talking big time SEC football. I mean, granted, he played well at Wake Forest, although his last few games, if you look, passing wise, not the greatest. But I tell you, 1-2 things that he does bring that Georgia fans haven't seen in a while is, for one thing, the guy can run. Georgia hasn't had a running threat at quarterback. You got to go back to Quincy Carter. You're talking 20 years. In fact, Newman had 2 100-yard rushing games last year. Georgia's had 2 by a quarterback, 100 rushing yard games, just 2 in the last 29 years, ending 2020. And another great thing about him, he seems a good fit for the new offensive coordinator, Tom Monken, because he can get the ball down the field. He throws a good, deep ball. He's a big guy. And, that's something Georgia lacked a little bit with Fromm, and a little bit in 18 and definitely 19.
Patrick, one of the things that I was kind of looking at is, to me, Jamie Newman's like the biggest wild card on this list. And do you think that he'll be able to get Georgia's offense and master it without having that offseason to kind of work on it? That's my biggest question with him. I think he's a guy where you look and he's a potential first-round pick, but then how do you put it together? How do you think that?
Yeah, something like this certainly doesn't help, the off-season things. But as you guys know, whether it's at Alabama, Auburn, some of these Georgia, these big-time programs, they're having an off-season as much as they can, right? The guy's intelligent. He comes from Wake Forest ran a real dynamic RPO offense. It's going to take him time to grasp the system, but maybe not quite like others stepping into Todd Monken's, I guess, air raid offense, as he calls it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like from an Alabama perspective, I think that game between Alabama and Georgia in week 3 is probably going to determine this argument in terms of, for next year between those two quarterbacks. And then, from an Auburn perspective, we've already seen Bo Nix beat Mac Jones. Is that something, Bryan? I mean, what did you see from Bo in that game? I mean, the stats weren't really there, but I don't know. Did you think that Bo Nix will? What about just his ability? I guess just to be a game winner.
Well, I think that's defines Bo Nix, and that really defined his dad too. If I think back to his dad's best moments, they came against Alabama on the road against Florida back in '93, '94. Those big moments, he came in and made plays, and that's what Bo has done in his short career so far. So, I think the thing you can count with Bo Nix is if Auburn's close in the fourth quarter against any team, he has a chance to win the game for you. And the other thing with Bo is because of who he is, who his dad is, the type of work ethic he has, he's going to do everything in his power over the summer during this, pandemic while everybody's away from football to learn as much as he can and try to be as ready as he can whenever football does return. So in many ways, I think Bo Nix, while he may not have the receiving core around him like Mac Jones will, of course, may not have as much talent around him like Jamie will at Georgia. I just think because of the way he leads and because of his personality and his ability to make plays, I stack him right up there with those two. And when they match up, and I think he's going to keep Auburn in most games, even if they're out-talented in some areas.
Yeah, that sort of brings up a good point. How these quarterbacks progress and perform speaks a good deal to the talent of the receivers and the guys around them. I think a lot of people are familiar with Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith at Alabama, so maybe that is one advantage for Mac Jones. But Patrick, I did want to kind of ask you, do you expect Georgia to open it up a little bit? I think that was something that, fans of both Georgia maybe, but perhaps across the SEC kind of scratched their head at times. Georgia was maybe a little more conservative than people expected.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that was the wide receivers. It's been well publicized how, Georgia was really depleted, and it hurt Jake Fromm in the passing game those last, 5-6 games with Newman, who averaged, I think it was 16 and a half yards a pass attempt when throwing over 20 yards or more. So that's per attempt compared to Fromm's like 10 and a half last year. That's just spectacular. And I think just that alone with Monken's, part of his philosophy is to attack deep. I can see Georgia open it up a good bit more, let's just say, compared to a year ago.
Patrick, just on Jamie in general, I did want to kind of ask you, as fans across the SEC probably didn't watch a lot of Wake Forest games last year, but they obviously, I assume you probably watched by now, but obviously Wake Forest has this unique mesh point offense where the entire offense is predicated on the quarterback and the running back sort of just standing in the backfield, both holding the ball on sort of some sort of delayed handoff, or he pulls it and kind of throws it. Do you think that is something that, maybe was holding him back statistically, or do you think that maybe that offense was helping him and maybe his numbers are inflated a little bit?
I could see, like I said, the first 7 games compared to 5, it's truly like night and day for Newman last year. We're talking 47% passing completion the latter part compared to 67 the first half year plus. You got to look at, though, Wake did lose 2 of their top receivers, or had lost 2 of them by the time, I guess, that 8th game. I think that was a lot of what really decreased his performance. I mean, running and stuff like that, it was still the same, but I think a lot of it was kind of like what happened to Jake last year at Georgia, losing those top tier receivers really hurt.
And Bryan, I did just sort of, since we're talking about sort of the weapons around, do you expect Bo Nix to sort of have, a better supporting cast this year that can kind of help him grow in year 2?
In some ways, yes. I think Seth Williams is a maturing receiver. Already seen him mentioned as a potential first-round pick in next year's draft. But he's not sort of a over-the-top explosive guy, although he has that ability to make those big plays. But you got Anthony Schwartz, who's also a track guy, but is a pretty good football player. And they signed 4 receivers in the 2020 class that, some guys that are pretty talented. We'll see if they can help out too. And you got Eli Stove, who's been around for a long time. He's a pretty fast, quick twitch guy who also does a lot of the end rounds for him, along with Schwartz. But on the other side, you've got an offensive line that has to totally rebuild. Both tackles, both guards have moved on. And, they brought in a couple of junior college guys. They've got a couple of guys that have been in the program 3 or 4 years but haven't played much. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that offense looks with Chad Morris, with all those new faces in the lineup.
I did want to, before we go further, I'll just sort of mention, obviously there are other quarterbacks in the SEC that aren't represented here today. Kyle Trask at Florida and Kellen Mond at Texas A&M probably stand out as 2 of the better quarterbacks. I would sort of want to, let y'all go on that. Do y'all think that those guys are kind of in the mix as well? And, I think everybody here has covered at least 1 or 2 of those quarterbacks in the last year or 2. Or do y'all think that those guys have kind of maybe already, maybe they're 3rd or 4th, but maybe they're not quite that same, in that same mix, where I think a lot of the guys we're talking about today maybe don't have the floor that those guys have, but very high ceilings, and if they can continue to progress.
Yeah, I think you hit it with that. In just the case of, when you look at what you got in Trask and what you got in Mon, you kind of already know what you have there. I think when you got a guy like Mac Jones, you've seen a preview, and Newman obviously is completely new. And then Bo Nix, he was a freshman last year. So all 3 of those guys see big improvements, especially with Nix. I think, his ability to make plays with his feet as well. I like all 3 of those guys at the potential way more than, maybe Trask or Mon, in terms of just, what they're able to do over a full season where they're, comfortable.
I agree with Tony. First of all, I'm excited to see, what guys like Jamie Newman and Matt Jones can do. I think they're going to put up great numbers. The other guy I would mention that could put up great numbers is Miles Brennan for LSU. I know they've got I think 13 or 14 guys drafted, and they're sort of reloading, but that system that he's got over there now, and they're going to have great receivers. They got certainly one for sure. He's probably going to put up some pretty good numbers himself.
Absolutely. Good point. Patrick, did you want to add anything on just either of those quarterbacks?
I will say, I tend to be kind of a proof as in the pudding guy, and with Newman, there's all this excitement, but with Trask, Mon, they have shown what they could do, but I agree both with Tony and Bryan, though at the same time, the potential there is pretty exceptional. One thing I was going to ask Bryan real quick is, there's always been, at least under Malzahn, there's been, whether it was Johnson, Stenham, and Nick Marshall, these Auburn quarterbacks that all, for some reason, maybe in year 2 or year 3, they regress a little bit. Is that a notion at all whatsoever at Auburn with this guy, or is that not even a thought?
No, that is a good point. If you look at Nick Marshall, he put up better numbers passing, but team-wise, the team sort of fell short of his expectations. Jarrett Stidham did not put up as good numbers his second year as his first year, and the team was not as good either. So I think that's a really interesting point. And then when you look at that offensive line, maybe that'll affect Bo. Although I think one of the biggest difference would be Chad Morris, the new offensive coordinator, and what he did with those quarterbacks at Clemson and at SMU. And then, of course, he wasn't very good at Arkansas as a head coach, but I think many people still respect him as a quarterback coach and offensive coordinator. So that'll be something to really watch. And, of course, you've got the backdrop of, no football, no spring practice, and we don't know exactly how things are going to go here in the next couple months either.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. When you look at sort of Bo Nix's success and his numbers, you know, at least inside the state, you know, I know that Alabama fans express this, and I know Auburn fans express this. It seemed like Bo Nix, there was a lot of excitement early, and then as the season kind of winded down, maybe especially when you get to the, you know, the LSU and Georgia games, maybe some of that excitement faded because, at least from the fans' perspective on both sides, there was maybe frustration for Auburn fans, or maybe excitement for Alabama fans, that Bo Nix didn't appear to be progressing as much inside the year, at least from what fans could tell. Do you think that's a fair point, that maybe he sort of seemed to plateau early in the season and didn't progress, or are there some things that you saw that maybe the numbers don't really show us?
Well, I think my biggest, I guess I wouldn't call it negative, but I don't think Gus, who was running the offense at the time, and Auburn overall, just allowed Nix to sort of be himself enough.
Mm-hmm.
I thought they tried to be a run play action team throughout most of the season. I don't think Auburn was ever a run play action team. They couldn't get a lot of push at the offensive line, even with those fifth-year seniors up front. They didn't really have a above average tailback that was ready to go. So I think that sort of put him in tough situations. A lot of times he's throwing in second and third and long, which is not ideal for a true freshman. But on the other hand, I thought one of the most impressive things that Nix did this past fall was he went 165 straight throws without interception, which to me is amazing for even a veteran quarterback, and especially for a true freshman playing against the schedule that Auburn played against.
The streak's still going, right? Like, doesn't he have a streak coming into the
I think it is. Yeah. I believe it is. Yes.
Yeah.
that's
go ahead, Tony.
That's one of the biggest knocks on Mac was those 2 interceptions that he threw against Auburn. But yeah, I think it's going to be important for each one of these guys to really take care of the ball. I mean, in each one of these systems, you know, you're not gonna be the guy if you can't take care of the ball. Obviously, that cost Alabama in the Iron Bowl. One of the things though with Newman I saw was the 11 picks. Is that a concern among Auburn? I'm sorry, among Georgia fans. That's he definitely has the highest number of picks between the bunch.
Yeah, and like I said, those last 5 games, I think 6 of those 11 came in 5 of them, including 3. They played Michigan State, I think, in the Pinstripe Bowl. I think 3 against them. I'd be concerned. You know, granted, you're going to get to Georgia and you're going to have, you know, better receivers, better line, whatnot. So there's always that. But, I mean, Jake found out last year against South Carolina and Georgia, you know, as a whole, you turn the ball over, 4 turnovers to 0, you're going to lose in the SEC. It doesn't matter if it's a 4-8 South Carolina team. So I think it's something to look at, the times he did turn the ball over.
You know, one thing I think we see just from a sort of macro standpoint in college football is most of the top quarterbacks can run and pick up yards with their feet, even if they don't always have to do that as sort of their first option. You know, do we have 3, you know, athletic quarterbacks with an ability to sort of scramble? You know, Patrick, I think you focused on that initially, that's maybe something Georgia's getting that Georgia hasn't had, as a quarterback that can actually pick up a first down on their own.
Well, I think Jamie – I'm sorry. I'll go ahead. I think Jamie is a true running quarterback, or a true dual threat guy. I think, you know, Pat Nix showed that, you know, he rushed for like 300 yards and 7 touchdowns. So I think he's a capable guy of running the ball or scrambling when needed. And I personally haven't – I guess Tony can comment on it. I haven't seen enough of Mac Jones to really have an opinion on his ability to run the ball.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people would expect Mac to be the odd man out in this conversation, just because, you know, Alabama doesn't do some of the running stuff that Georgia does, either that Auburn does, and then obviously neither of these guys are as dynamic of a runner as Jamie Newman. But, you know, I think Mac's got some really underrated athleticism. In fact, I was told that he was the fastest quarterback on the team last year, so he's, you know, faster than Tua was. So I think he can move. I think we saw that a little bit in the Auburn game, actually. I think, you know, it was a 4th and 7, and he scrambled for 18 yards. And he's not a running quarterback. You're certainly not going to, like, run a lot of read options with him or anything like that. But he's a guy that showed that, you know, if you don't respect him, he knows when to tuck the ball and run. I'm not sure if I'm totally comfortable with this projection, but, like, he can run in kind of the same way that Joe Burrow can run. I don't think you'd call him a running quarterback, but he's working a lot with his leg strength this offseason, and I think he's trying to get that escapability and that ability to kind of make defenses pay if nothing else is working.
Is there a, as we kind of, wind through it and wrap this up, what sort of all of these guys have a lot of questions, and we have a lot of questions just in the world in general these days. But Bryan, I'll sort of start with you. Is there a big thing that, a big question Bo Nix sort of has to answer if he's actually going to put himself in the mix to be the best quarterback in the SEC next year?
Can he elevate his teammates to play at a high level? Because there's going to be a lot of experience out there beside him, especially the offensive line position and at running back. And that puts a lot of pressure on his shoulders. So can he handle that pressure? Can he elevate his teammates? That's what great quarterbacks do, in my opinion. So this will be a really big test for him.
And then, Patrick, obviously, I know that you're, just because of everything that's happened, you're less familiar with Jamie than Tony is with Mac or Bryan is with Bo. But just from what you've seen, or maybe what you've seen from Georgia's offense, is there a question facing either him or the offense in general that they sort of need to answer if Georgia's going to kind of take that step from almost there as one of the top 4, top 5 teams in the country to actually to get there and kind of put the ball across the line this year?
There's actually a pretty simple answer, and it's Game 3 in Tuscaloosa. Georgia starts off on Labor Day against Virginia, turns around real quickly, plays East Tennessee State, and then that week, so it'll be the third game in 12 games, we'll play at Alabama. And, that game's early enough to, maybe with a minor test and no test at all, that's going to show you, basically the entire Georgia team. But definitely if Newman can somehow go over there and be impressive, then oh yeah, all of a sudden he could be a Heisman contender by late September.
Since you mentioned the Alabama game, I'll follow up. Most of Alabama's losses over the last several years have included facing a quarterback that can run and can pick up those yards. Do you think, how crucial is that Jamie brings that factor in, especially when those teams are going to square off in week 3?
I think it's a big deal, and that's why I mentioned it to begin with, him running, because it's something new. Georgia was with Fromm as quarterback the previous 3 years, one of the best in the country. And now you're adding a guy that, let's, forget passing for a second, but who can add that running dimension and could actually be a better deep ball thrower. It's got Georgia fans excited. And that's why when Jake declared early on January 8th, just 3 days later, Newman comes aboard, there wasn't a lot of disappointment, to be asked, from the fan base in general. I was surprised because everybody loved Jake Fromm, but it was kind of, hey, let's move on and see if we can actually be better, was the idea.
Absolutely. Thanks. And Tony, just sort of, same question to you.
Yeah, so I think when you're looking at Mac Jones, the number one thing he's going to have to do is the mental aspect. He's going to be facing a lot of pressure in terms of just following up Tua and keeping up to that standard. And then he's also got a guy like Bryce Young. I think if you look at the backup quarterbacks of each of these guys we just mentioned, Bryce Young's by far the best one. So there's going to be a push for people that are going to want to see more of him, and it's going to be kind of tough to be the starter. I think that Georgia game is also going to be a lot of pressure. So if he can make it through that initial wave of pressure of holding off Bryce Young for the starting job, and then B, kind of getting through that Georgia game, getting a win there, performing well against a top defense that Georgia's going to have, I think it gets kind of downhill from there. I think he can kind of, ride that momentum into a really good season.
Yeah, great. Thanks. But before we get out of here, I did want to ask, Bryan, Patrick, or Tony. Bryan, I'll sort of start with you. Was there anything that really sort of stood out to you about these other two guys that we're talking about, either a strength or a weakness that you've sort of seen from Jamie or Mac Jones at this point?
Well, to be honest, I was impressed with the way Mac Jones, came to Jordan-Hare Stadium and stepped in there and put up really big numbers. And yes, he made some mistakes, but I mean, he almost went out there and he put up, was it 40-something points on a really good defense, and then had those two pick sixes that, sort of sunk their chances. But I think he can put up huge numbers for Alabama. I really do. He's a very talented quarterback. And then, Jamie Newman, I haven't seen as much of because I don't watch a lot of ACC football but just looking at his highlights and just seeing his ability, I'm excited to see what he can do in the SEC. I love watching dual threat quarterbacks. I think they're so tough to defend defensively, and they can just change a game so quickly with their ability to run the ball and do the different things. So I think it's going to be fun to watch both those guys. I think it's going to be another fun year in the SEC. It's going to be really competitive, and there's a lot of really talented players, including a lot of good quarterbacks.
Yeah, that's exactly. I just hope to see a competitive season out of all these teams. Patrick, anything that you sort of saw from Bo Nix, or you're probably a lot more familiar with than Mac Jones at this point?
Yeah. I tell you, the thing about Nix is, he had his moments those first, first part of the season and even going into the second half. And then against Georgia, I always say, if there was a fifth quarter of that game, Georgia likely loses that because Auburn they were a totally different team that fourth quarter and maybe some change. And especially Nix, like he seemed like another guy. And then he does those two picks against Bama, but he's solid. I mean, he had a really good game. And then against Michigan, he had a really, really good game. So that's why I'm curious about Nix. Like, what's going to happen? Is he going to be kind of the inconsistent guy that he was off and on as late as into the Georgia game? Or is he just the true talent, the guy that shows up more than just in big moments, I guess, and as that's what he was considered by some there at first. But I think he could be extremely outstanding if he stays consistent.
And then, Tony, sort of same thing. You're probably not as familiar with Jamie, but obviously, you did see Bo Nix last year.
No, so I'll start with Jamie, though. I think, when you look at him, he's probably the most dynamic and probably the biggest wild card of this bunch because we haven't seen as much of him. But if all goes right for Jamie Newman, he could be a really dangerous, probably maybe even the most dangerous just because of the dual threat ability he brings out of this bunch. And I think when you look at Bo Nix, I think he's a grinder, and he's a guy with a huge ceiling as well. And a guy that I just expect once he gets, that consistency down, it's tough being a true freshman in the SEC. And so another year of comfortability for him. He's already grinded through some big games. He didn't win the LSU game and he didn't win the Georgia game, but he was there. He put his team in that position to win both those games. So I think he's a grinder. He obviously beat Alabama as well. So I think there's a lot of potential for every one of these guys that we talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's sort of a good point for us to wrap up. For everyone watching, I just want to, thank y'all for tuning in and, supporting not only us, but these guys too, Bryan and Patrick. We appreciate having them on. Definitely comment on the video and let us know if you think that, one of these three quarterbacks is going to kind of be the guy to sort of replace Tua and Joe Burrow as sort of the top two options in the SEC. And subscribe to the channel to keep up with us. And once again, I just want to thank all y'all for coming on, Tony, Bryan, and Patrick. We really appreciate y'all all getting together to have this conversation. I think it was fun.
Definitely, man. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.